Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw has built quite a career as a legal scholar. She developed the term intersectionality to explain the ways that multiple systems of power overlap to shape our lived experiences. But Crenshaw's work has also faced a great deal of pushback. Crenshaw came up with the phrase critical race theory, and that subject has been as controversial as it has been misunderstood.
Critical race theory has become a political flashpoint across the country.
Republican politicians have been hyping critical race theory as a threat to the impressionable minds of America's children.
President Biden and Senator Ted Cruz weighing in on the latest clash in the culture war, critical race theory.
Professor Crenshaw isn't afraid of controversy, and she refuses to back down. The title of her new book is Backtalker, an American memoir. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with influential scholar Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. Crenshaw is the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and Distinguished Professor of Law and Promise Institute Chair of Human Rights at the UCLA Law School. She's also Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum and author of the new book, Backtalker, an American memoir. Professor, I am so honored to have you on Disrupted.
Professor, it's so nice to be on Disrupted. Thank you for having me.
You are perhaps one of the most widely cited and widely recognized scholars of our time, which deserves attention. But I think sometimes people forget that there is a person behind the title and behind the work. And so I wanted to begin actually by talking about the person who grew up in Canton, Ohio. Now, as someone who spent 5 years in Ohio for graduate school, Canton isn't always the city that people think of when they think about community in Ohio. Share with our listeners that experience of growing up as a little Black girl in Canton, Ohio.
So Canton, Ohio is a small industrial town in the northeast of Ohio. It's about 60 miles from Cleveland, Ohio. It was known as the city that created and manufactured roller bearings. It's a company town, but it also was a steel making town and auto manufacturing town. My grandfather migrated from South Carolina to Canton, Ohio in the early 1920s while he was working his way through medical school as a Pullman porter. So my mother was born and raised in Canton, Ohio. I was born and raised in Canton, Ohio. Canton, like many of the other places in the Northeast Midwest, was not formally segregated by law, but was functionally segregated both by housing patterns and by custom. Partly because my grandfather was one of the few African Americans who didn't work for the major company towns, he was able to shape my mother's consciousness and orientation towards patterns of segregation to be one of resistance. They were able to push back against the customs of putting, Black people in the upper balcony during the movie theater days. They were able to push back against root beer stands that refused to give them drinks in the frosty mugs and instead tried to serve them in paper cups. So they were race men and women of the 20th century. And in many ways passed that on to me. I was born during a time before we were officially free. Most of the Civil Rights Acts hadn't been passed when I was born. The future of the country and our role in it was very much in contestation at that time. And my story that I tell in Backtalker is how that orientation to push against the material realities of, the shadow of segregation actually shaped how I thought about things, how I received the constraints, and how I pushed back against it. All of those experiences are the things that go into my thinking and ultimately found expression through critical race theory and intersectionality.
I want to return to those concepts because I think people use them and misuse them and abuse them in so many ways. But hearing you talk about those origins in Canton and of having your grandfather come from the South and bringing that understanding with him to working as a Pullman porter and all the storied history of that role while working his way through advanced education, it is your story, but it is the story of so many people that gets overlooked in the narratives about what it meant for families during that time and to exist in ways that does not fit the popular narrative, but is so personal. It makes the title of this book so important for all of us. And I want to make sure we have the full title. That new book is called Backtalker, an American Memoir. That second piece is so critical. Tell me about the journey to write an American memoir for you.
I am so glad you asked that question because I was very much aware that this book was going to hit the shelves in the middle of the commemoration of our 250th year as a nation. Against that backdrop, there are demands that patriotism be framed in terms of suppressing stories like ours. There actually are even laws these days that suggest that if we tell the full story of the United States, if we include our voices, those whose labor, both productive and reproductive labor, were stolen in order to build this country, to celebrate without our stories being part of it is to effectively erase us. It's effectively to impose upon people of African descent the same constraint that was imposed on our ancestors, to be quiet, to not resist, to accept the conditions of our lives as they are, to believe that our dreams and our aspirations and our demands are un-American, are foreign, are damaging and divisive. This is more or less what the attack on critical race theory, on intersectionality, the effort to erase these ideas and the histories that the ideas are grounded on basically amounted to. So my journey to write this book, especially the last couple laps of it, were to say, number one, the distortions and the erasures that have been foundational to the attacks on critical race theory and intersectionality are coercive, but can only be successful if we acquiesce, if we allow ourselves to be rewritten in their narrative. I know where critical race theory came from. I know where these ideas were generated. It was in the real lived experiences of people like me who came of age in a particular time in American history and who articulated what that experience looked like and how it constituted our lives. So for me to write this memoir is to make it clear that the ideas that we are battling to sustain are generated from not just my experience, but many, many others. And it is as American as apple pie. There's nothing extraneous, nothing corrosive about saying these stories and using these ideas to reach into policy and legal and knowledge producing institutions. That's what our generation did when we integrated these spaces. So I wanted to tell my memoir as an American story, as that voice, as representative of and welcoming in other memoirs and other voices that complete the story of America rather than contest it.
That juxtaposition between celebrating, honoring, recognizing what it meant for this nation to assert its freedom, to assert its independence against the backlash against any attempt to just be, to not even think about being free, but to just be, is why I think the timing of this book and the title, the full title, are so important. You write in the book that backtalk is not simply resistance. It is a refusal to disappear. That has stuck with me in so many ways in terms of what it means for me to be a Black woman professor from the South. All of the things that our profession would say should not exist. But also, Professor, you are very clear in this book that backtalking is a practice of refusal to disappear, but also that there are always consequences to the backtalk that people have to recognize and be willing to bear. What does backtalking mean for you, not just in the work that you do, but for the experiences that you are bringing to light for us to remember? What does backtalking mean?
My choice of the title Backtalking is meant to, first of all, acknowledge that as subordinated people, we sit in a position to be disciplined by power. We are downstream from those who exercise control, coercive measures to limit what we can say back to their impositions, to the ways in which our forward momentum has been reversed, to the ways in which the values, the norms that have shaped a loose consensus over the last several decades that there is repair work that needs to be done. There is still the shadow of segregation, of genocide, of enslavement that shapes our life chances. We are being told now that to push forward, we are being woke, we are being divisive, we are being un-American. So we are being placed in a position in which our understanding of our lives is framed as infantilizing. We are being told what we can legitimately say and expect. Starting with that acknowledgement, what is to be done as citizens, as individuals, as fully formed human beings who are being told something and are being punished when we don't acquiesce? Well, the only choice is to talk back. The only choice is to resist. The only choice is to refuse our erasure. So I wanted to mobilize that transgressive sense of talking back and use it as a framework for what we all have to do. All those people who consider themselves to be stakeholders in a functioning, multiracial democracy have got to talk back to that faction. And it's been a consistent faction over the course of American history that would rather break this country rather than share it. What's to be done in the face of their ascendancy again? Well, talking back is at least the first step that has to be done. And I wanted to tell the story of how talking back has been part of our history that led to where we are now. And we have to mine all of that knowledge and wisdom and courage to be able to mount this kind of resistance again.
Coming up, more from Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, author of Backtalker, an American memoir. She'll discuss the recent attacks on critical race theory.
The point was to use critical race theory as a framework to attack all teaching about race, racism, racial power, and our past and the way it is structured.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with legal scholar Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. She developed the terms intersectionality and critical race theory. Crenshaw is a professor at Columbia Law School and UCLA Law School. Her new book is Backtalker, an American memoir. Before the break, we talked about the meaning of talking back. Here's more of our conversation. I find, Professor, that so many people aren't just silent because they don't care. They are silent because they are fearful of the backlash. When we look at the large numbers of Black women, for example, who have been pushed out of the workforce over these last 2 years, when we look at teachers and librarians who are pushed out of their job for giving a child a book, when we think about the attacks on people like you, who dare to speak your truth every day, that fear is real and it is rational, and yet it can't be the stopping point. How does fear show up for you, or does fear show up for you as you are doing this work and sharing not just the history and the policy, but you are sharing your personal journey as well?
It would be disingenuous to say that there isn't fear in the air and inside me. That's the point of coercion. That's the point of repression. Authoritarian regimes can't reach everybody, but they can make an example out of enough people so that everyone else acquiesces. In fact, one of our challenges now is what Tim Snyder calls anticipatory compliance, acquiescing even before we are asked to, because of the fear of what might happen. So it is real, even beyond the possibility of coercion. Just having observed over the last couple years how effectively a concerted, organized, extremist faction can rename and redefine ideas and the people who have articulated those ideas. I've watched as intersectionality becomes completely rewritten by those who want to silence what it does and what it draws attention to. And it's frankly not just the extremists that one might reasonably be fearful of. It is mainstream institutions who acquiesce to the far right by saying these ideas, these people, this history, it's controversial because a few very loud organizations and people and politicians have said so. So we're going to give them the heckler's veto. I witnessed that myself with the College Board, who took out intersectionality and structural racism and all basically the ideas and the grammar that are necessary to be able to describe and analyze the ongoing conditions that are the afterlives of enslavement and segregation. Doing so because they said that these ideas are now politically toxic because a few people said so. So I am, of course, concerned about how that power has been given to a small faction of the United States and what then are the consequences of that. But that fear pales in comparison to what our ancestors and forebears in this struggle had to deal with. I had the pleasure of joining with thousands of people at Selma for the 60-year anniversary. And standing on the top of that bridge, knowing as you're walking down that bridge that our civil rights leaders 60 years earlier saw those police officers on mounted horse, saw the tear gas canisters, saw all of that, and still marched into it because they knew they had a greater mission to fight back against tyranny, against this repression. So I can't afford to let the fear undermine our role in ensuring that all the sacrifices that they made were for naught. I don't want to be that generation that failed to pass the baton to the next one. So it helps one to put one's fear in check, recognizing that we do have a mission collectively to defend and expand that vision of democracy.
I was there in Selma for the 50th anniversary, and it is perhaps one of the most defining moments of my life. To be there at the base of that bridge, John Lewis to my left, to share that moment with my daughter, at the time was like 9 years old, to look ahead of us with Edmund Pettus's name looming over all of us on that bridge. But in the middle of that bridge was then President Barack Obama, standing beside a former President, George W. Bush. And to be held by a community in that space, and to imagine, I tell this story, our daughter got to the middle of the bridge and just stopped walking. And as you know, from those bridge crossings, there are thousands of people. It's hot. You have to go. And she would not move. And we kept saying, like, what's wrong? What's wrong? And she said, Mommy, I don't know what's on the other side.
Oh.
And for me, it was this moment for all of us, is that fear of not knowing what's on the other side stops us in doing what we know needs to be done. And those who are in positions of power and influence use that to their benefit. Fast forward to 2020, 2021, where people are trying to respond to the murders of George Floyd and so many others, investing that response in virtue signaling as opposed to substantive change. We then see not just the back talk, but the backlash of suddenly people telling me that, oh, they're teaching critical race theory in my kid's elementary school. And I'm saying, do you actually know what critical race theory is? I mean, I'm a scholar with a PhD, and I don't think that's being taught in your elementary school. And so that ignorance combined with power becomes a lethal combination, because then it does, as you say, overlook the everyday realities. The other concept, Professor, that gets taken out of context all the time and so watered down is a framework that you developed in the late 1980s, and that is the development of intersectionality. I bristle when people say, well, intersectionality means that we're all a part of multiple groups and therefore we're all the same. And I'm like, no, that's not what she means. You don't need me to tell you what you mean. Talk to us about that organizing framework, because you provide a nuance and a context that gets overlooked, and I think feeds into why backtalking is so important.
Ooh, and let me just take a moment to identify how profound what you just said was, that ignorance with power is an atomic weapon against the forward advancement that we believed we were all part of. I think if there's ever exhibit A of what that means, it is in how effective the backlash against the moment of racial reckoning, the widest, deepest social movement in our history in terms of people coming out, was 2020. And the effective backlash against that's taken us back, not just to before 2020, but effectively to before 1954, just shows how effective power can be when it mobilizes itself around weaponizing ignorance. And that is what we've seen. And I have to be honest, I didn't even know how to respond to this. You're teaching critical race theory in the schools, because I thought, oh, this is really a factual question. So I'm going to go on, television and say, I know for a fact that people are not teaching critical race theory in the schools because I'm the co-author of the book on critical race theory, and I would know if they were. But that wasn't the point. The point was to use critical race theory as a framework to attack all teaching about race, racism, racial power, and our past and the way it is structured even today. So we needed to pay attention to what they were really going after, and that is literacy about our nation, about its dynamics, and what is continuous from the past. Having learned that lesson, now it is abundantly clear for me that the same thing is happening with intersectionality. They're not remotely interested in understanding how intersectionality is a framework for seeing, describing, analyzing, and remedying the ways in which power on the basis of race, gender, class, sexuality, and any other framework is not mutually exclusive, but many times it overlaps, it interacts, and consequently produces exclusions, marginalizations that are greater than the sum of its part. To be specific, intersectionality was a framework that I used simply to offer courts a remedial prism to see what they were not seeing. When Black women were attempting to bring employment discrimination lawsuits against industries that didn't hire them or promote them. And this was not an uncommon situation in industries that were segregated by race and by gender. Some industries had jobs that were Black jobs, and those were usually unskilled labor, heavy labor, janitorial jobs, not management jobs. And they had jobs that were women's jobs, which were usually secretarial, receptionist, front office. The problem, in addition to those, structures, was that the Black jobs were not jobs available for women, and the women's jobs were not jobs available for Blacks. So a Black woman had no place, no avenue for hiring or advancement. But when Black women tried to sue, courts would say, you can't prove race discrimination because we do hire Black people. They're just all men. And you can't prove gender discrimination because we do hire women. They're just all white. I was stunned because it seems so simple to say, well, of course, if you're protected against race or gender discrimination, you should be protected against race and gender discrimination. Those two things are happening at the same time. The court said, not so fast. If we allow you to combine these causes of action, we're giving you something that we're not giving anyone else. Of course, no one else actually needed it at that time. It was Black women who needed to be able to tell their story as a compounded form of discrimination. So intersectionality was simply a way to use a simple metaphor or an analogy to get judges to use the knowledge that they have from the world around them and apply it to this conceptual challenge. They go through intersections every day where traffic coming one direction overlaps with traffic going in another direction. That's what these Black women were trying to argue. So initially, it was remedial. You guys say you can't see it. Just use this framework, and that will help you understand what these Black women are trying to say. It turns out that there are a lot of intersectional problems. So the framework ended up being useful for millions of people to describe experiences that fell outside of the conventional way of thinking about discrimination as singular rather than compounded.
It seems so simple. Where people get hung up, intentionally in some ways, is on the remedy part. Because now if I point out a problem, I have an obligation to not turn the other way. I can no longer be comforted by pretending that the problem does not exist. Our human side says if a problem exists, we need to fix it or address it. And that's what makes people uncomfortable. Because if now I produce a remedy that recognizes how Black women are situated in the workforce, then they may get something that I don't have. Or now I may have to compete in a very different way. And I'm uncomfortable with that. So let me just shut down the process, because then I preserve my privilege or my perception of privilege without recognizing my own vulnerability. And I can block others from doing that. It would seem then, Professor, that intersectionality, the intersecting ways in which our lives, our life chances are shaped is so pervasive that people then see it in everything to the point where it loses some of the intellectual power because of how people have abused it. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a more meta question. This is my nerd professor kicking in. Scholarship is so personal, right? We put so much into that. To be a scholar whose work becomes public brings a whole other level there. And I want to name that because I think in some of these debates, these misguided debates, people forget you are a scholar. You are a trained, well-read scholar. This isn't just an opinion. This isn't just me search. although that has its place too. But you are a scholar trained in these legal concepts, trained in the history, trained in the policy. What does it mean for you then that when your life's work, right, we can't control it once it's released? How do you navigate through that of having your life's work be used in these ways that were not the original intention?
I sometimes find myself on the phone with mentors and friends complaining about the way that some of my work has been distorted and wondering whether the same thing would happen to another scholar whose work has been widely taken up or who is writing about, I don't know, astronomy or something else. And then they'll say, well, somebody developed a theory about this thing you're complaining about. Let me think, what is it called? And they'll put the mirror up and say, and remind me of the truth of the matter. I do not exist outside the power dynamics that I'm writing about. One of my mentors, Barbara Arnwine, always says to me, Kim, dogs don't bark at parked cars. It's a way of reminding me that, yes, my life's work is bringing forward into this moment a long history of efforts on the part of millions to give voice to the ways that our society still needs to attend to the promises of the Reconstruction era amendments, still give voice to the March on Washington speech. We were coming here to cash a check that was returned insufficient funds, to put our hands on the moral arc of the universe, to bend it. It won't bend on its own. It's going to take people being mobilized and motivated to do so. And there's going to be resistance to that. That helps me get back into, the swing of things and understanding that some of this is going to be the inevitable consequence of the scholarship that challenges conventional beliefs and frankly, ignorance as well.
Coming up, more from Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw, author of Backtalker, an American memoir. She'll talk about what she thinks people who read the book can do next.
One of the things that I invite people into is a rethinking of how we consider our language among ourselves as allies.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with influential legal scholar Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw. We're discussing her new book, Backtalker, an American memoir. Before the break, Professor Crenshaw mentioned one of her mentors, civil rights lawyer Barbara Arnwine. Here's more of our conversation. I love that you named Barbara Arnwine. She is such a brilliant mind. I think it speaks, Professor, for the need for us to continuously have mentors who can speak life into us, who can correct and guide us in love, but also remind us that we don't do this work alone. You are often photographed in a T-shirt that says certified backtalker. And on this show, we think of disruptors, right? People who are, by their very existence, the work they do, the ways that they show up fully and unapologetically, are disrupting the status quo and what we learned from that. Who are the certified backtalkers that connect you in those ways to know there are other folks who are backtalking as well?
In the book, I tell a story about where some of the backtalking is even more challenging because sometimes the backtalking we have to do is inside our own communities. So I ended up meeting Barbara Arnwine when I was a junior in college, organizing the State of Black America conferences that we had at Cornell in the Africana Studies Center. And up until that point, we had never invited a woman to come and speak. I just I couldn't abide it. I refused to accept it, lobbied for it, found her as a young lawyer leading up the lawyers committee in Boston. And having won that round, had to fight yet another round with some of my sisters about what role I was going to play when she came on campus. Was I going to be making the Kool-Aid, or was I actually going to be interacting with this amazing civil rights leader who happened to be a woman? And it's a whole scene about, what happened in that moment. But she became a guiding light in my life, the image of the lawyer, the person who loves her community and was willing to use the law in every way she could in order to talk back against where we had been relegated. So she is my vision of what I eventually wanted to become. And of course, the book in many ways is a tribute to my mother and her mother, who were backtalkers extraordinaire. It starts with my mother integrating a swimming pool at 3 years old before she even knew what was going on, and extended to the day that she passed, in which she was a backtalker in her assisted living facility, the only person there who had an Obama sign on her door. So I learned not only the imperative to talk back, the skill to talk back, but also sometimes the consequences of it, not just politically, not just economically or within her profession, because she experienced those, but sometimes even inside her closest relationships. So, being a disruptor, which is, I love that as a parallel concept, means there's no space in which you can simply say, well, okay, I'm going to hang my hat at the door and not say what I see, and insist on examining some of the assumptions that we see playing out. And sometimes there are consequences to that, but there are also consequences to not doing that.
I want to lift another quote from you. You write, "Silence is often rewarded because it reassures power." And I think about what you just shared about the consequences of being a certified backtalker, and being willing to accept those consequences because you realize that silence may reassure others, but it will rankle your soul when you just sit in that, and that not really is comfort. One of the things, Professor, that I so appreciate about you and your work, and I consider you to be an intellectual mentor from afar because I just so appreciate what you do. You're creating space for cross-generational conversation and understanding, which I think is so important because often people don't tell their stories because they want that neat, shiny veneer of success to be what they are known for. And then for the people who are coming after us who may struggle or realize that life is not linear, they don't have that orientation to understand, no, actually, this is a part of the process. This book intentionally cuts across generations to tell your generation's story, but to not talk at, but with those who are yet to come. How important is that for the work that you're doing to be in these spaces with people at all different stages of their lives?
I think one of the great losses of our receipt of the history of struggle has been the sort of linear framing that leaves out where the struggles really were, the reversals that sometimes happen, the fact that we were not all aligned, the fact that some of the real leaders we never saw or heard about because they were in the back office somewhere. And importantly, in the context of the things that fall out of the bucket or the things that people forgot to tell somebody were some of the specific ways that women were situated in our society and in the struggle. And at the end of the day, that failure to pass on the word leads us to inferences that are many times damaging. I saw that, I write about this in the context of the Anita Hill testimony. too many African Americans believed that she was talking about something that was foreign to Black women's experience, that we had nothing to do with sexual harassment, didn't happen to us, didn't bother us when it did. And partly because of that, it was easy for Clarence Thomas to point the finger at her as the traitor to our community and point to himself as the real victim of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. You know, he was able to wrap her testimony in the language of a high-tech lynching. And she had nothing that she could say that resonated broadly inside our community. Now, the reality is that the history of sexual harassment is the history of Black women's lives in this country since we arrived on these shores. Enslavement was nothing but industrialized sexual abuse. The history, the ideology, the way that we've been imagined has been a continuous reflection of that material fact, which leads to harassment, which leads to the belief that nobody's going to believe us anyway, which leads to even Black people saying, even if he did all the things that he said he did, she wasn't harmed by that because Black women know how to handle themselves. All of these things are the consequences of not having a full intergenerational passage of the actual struggles, what we were struggling about, what role we played. It's not just the stories of the people that remain untold that are damaged. It's future generations that are damaged by that. And frankly, if we look at what the consequences of that particular moment have been, the damage is to our entire nation. That confirmation hearing has led directly to 5-4 decisions that undermine the ability to limit the role of money in politics. It undermined the Voting Rights Act, the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. There's so many consequences of the failure to pass on all of the wisdom, all the knowledge, and all of the experiences. So in this moment, what I am trying to do, both in the work of my organization, the African American Policy Forum, and my scholarship, and in my memoir, is to gather up as much as I can to put it on the table, to make it available to future generations. I want people in the future to know that we knew what was going on. I want them to be able to see the lessons that were not passed on and what the consequences were, so that future generations cannot make some of those mistakes and have the wisdom necessary in order to fight back more effectively.
It is why this book, for me, feels not just as a critique or an indictment. It feels like an invitation. It feels like an invitation to imagine differently, to imagine more boldly, and to imagine and co-create more inclusively, wherever that space is that we find ourselves. That, for me, Professor, is an invitation to hope. Even and in spite of all the things that we see every day that would tell us we are not entitled to hope. As we come to the close of our time together, and I think about that invitation that you offer in this book, what would you say to people who think about civic responsibility or civic engagement in this moment? What would you say to those who read Backtalker and think about what their next could be?
I love your framing of the book as not simply a critique, but an invitation. I have tried over the course of the last several years to make the invitation concrete, to provide opportunities for people who are activated by, who see themselves in the stories, or who are reaffirmed in their belief that the world we live in does not have to look the way it does. We have the wherewithal to push back against it. One of the things that I invite people into is a rethinking of how we consider our language among ourselves as allies. One of the most challenging dimensions of this current moment is that the way racial injustice is framed is through a framework of I scratch your back and you scratch mine, sort of transactional. Mm-hmm. And it is true that it's a weapon of division, but transactional frameworks were not the things that led those people on Edmund Pettus Bridge to keep going. Transactional frameworks was not what lifted people during the March on Washington. Transactional frameworks was not what took Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney in the South to put their lives on the line for voting rights. That wasn't transactional. That was a moral imperative. That was, I cannot live in a world that allows this to happen. So we have to find the ways of reconnecting our contemporary struggle to that spirit, that imperative, that community that came together in order to get us to where we are now. So I look for those opportunities. And I talk about in the book having met the amazing Brian Stevenson when we were both 17. And we've always been, doing this work in parallel paths. Now we're coming together to try to do work of historical memory and contemporary activation, bringing people together to recommit, but recommit by immersing ourselves in the history, in the artifacts, in the sacred spaces that Montgomery provides. So I look for those opportunities, and I welcome others to also share what they're doing in that way. We will be coming together at the Legacy Museum on July the 27th for several days for us just to sit with what these museums bring to us, what a civil rights memorial does, how do we incorporate what Brian has been able to curate in our framing, in our articulation, in our policy making, and in our defense of democracy. And I think that's what all of us need to be doing now that this education is being taken away from us, the language is being taken away from us, the media is facilitating it, and organized efforts on the part of those who want to take us back to a period before equity became a value in our society. Anyone who wants to fight that has to figure out what our strategy is going to be to re-elevate these ideas in our culture and in our personal commitments.
I thank you for reminding us that this is a call to return to community and to return to connection and to tell our stories so that we can be reminded. Kimberlé Williams Crenshaw is Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. She is Promise Institute Chair on Human Rights at the UCLA Law School. She's also Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, and her new memoir is Backtalker, an American memoir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I know that you are on the same wavelength, so thank you for having me.
This episode was produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Erica McIntosh, and Robin Doyon-Aiken. Meg Fitzgerald is our Senior Manager of Projects and Radio Programming. Our interns are Amanda Adams and Katie Service. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. And you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.